I found a British edition of Grace the Glitter Fairy, so here's another long video where I describe all of the changes between the two English versions of the book. This doesn't include spelling changes, like the British version has an extra U in the word color, or minor grammatical changes like the American version doesn't capitalize the word queen. Since the British version came first, that's the official version. I will always mention that first, and then the American change to it. So for example, in the illustration, sweet shop is changed to candy shop. That means it was sweet shop in England and candy shop in the United States. Greenwood is changed from one word to two. In the opening poem, throughout all fairyland becomes throughout all of fairyland. Shine your wand and press your dress becomes pull out your wand and fanciest dress. HRH, meaning Her Royal Highness, is removed from the fairy godmother's name. Chapter 1. The title of the chapter goes from a party afoot to a party plan. A frown on her face becomes a frown came over her face. Horrid Jack Frost becomes Jack Frost. Replied in a determined voice becomes replied, sounding determined. And the whole human world becomes in the human world. The rainbow fairies and the weather fairies becomes many fairies. Against Jack Frost's evil spells becomes when Jack Frost caused trouble with his evil spells. Now it was the turn of the party fairies becomes now they were working with the party fairies. Mean old Jack Frost becomes Jack Frost. He can't stop causing trouble even though he's been banished to his ice castle becomes he just can't stop being mischievous. If he hadn't been such a pest becomes if he wasn't always so mean. 1000th Jubilee becomes 1000th Anniversary. Invited to the Fairyland party themselves becomes invited to the Fairyland party by the fairy godmother. The paragraph about the goblins gets an extra sentence which explains the plot. Would appear to set things right becomes showed up to fix the party problems. Scrabbling noise becomes rustling. Parcel becomes package, here and everywhere else. The garden becomes our yard, here and everywhere else. Puzzled becomes confused. We've got becomes we have. Called becomes named. Give you a hand becomes give you some help. Kind becomes nice. Beamed becomes said. Of course we will becomes of course. Turn up and try to spoil becomes show up and try to make trouble at. Chapter 2. A bit becomes kind of. Running around enjoying themselves becomes running around and having a good time. Though is moved to the end of the sentence. Frighten becomes scare. The word exactly is removed. A parcel becomes a small present. The word excitedly is removed. Beamed becomes smiled. Come on becomes come on in. Mummy becomes mommy, here and everywhere else. Lounge becomes family room, here and everywhere else. And it's Rachel, isn't it? Becomes and Rachel, right? Kind becomes nice. Fizzing becomes bursting. Would you girls be able to becomes do you think you girls could? The word please is removed from the sentence. Now Mrs. Cooper is less polite. Gold-colored becomes glittery. That becomes which. Lay the table becomes set the table. Of course we can becomes absolutely. Hurried off becomes hurried. Said Jamie proudly becomes Jamie said proudly. Before he'd got very far becomes before he got very far. About 50 centimeters becomes no more than 2 feet. Rest of it is okay becomes rest of the roll is fine. Lengths becomes short pieces. Had been spoiled in exactly the same way becomes were ruined too. It's just as if someone has cut the streamers becomes it looks like someone cut the streamers into lots of pieces. Rachel nodded solemnly becomes Rachel nodded. She asked becomes she asked with a frown on her face. Jamie looked as if he were becomes Jamie was looking. I've got becomes I know. I won't be long becomes I'll be right back. Sticky tape becomes tape here and everywhere else. Stripey becomes striped. There was a ring at the doorbell becomes the doorbell rang. That'll be becomes that should be. Jamie has beaten me to it becomes Jamie beat me to it. Chuckled becomes laughed. Dashed becomes raced. Bowler hat becomes Hat, he was about to burst becomes he might explode. We've almost finished becomes we're almost finished. We've just got the balloons to blow up becomes we just have to put up the balloons. But to their dismay becomes but they groaned when they saw that. The streamers, which they had so carefully pinned up earlier, becomes the streamers. Lay in heaps becomes were in piles. Said crossly becomes said, scowling, and the sentence starting with the girls worked is split into two sentences. Called eagerly becomes answered immediately. Although becomes even though. Remained becomes stayed. Peering becomes looking. Exchanged a look becomes glanced at each other. Checked all the other balloons becomes check the balloons. Are all the balloons spoiled becomes are there any balloons we can blow up? Are they all ruined? Large becomes big. Is it balloons you need? Becomes did I hear you need balloons? Some spares becomes extras. French windows becomes French doors. Beautiful, tall doors with windows from top to bottom. I guess they figured Americans don't know what French doors are. They're called French doors for the rest of the book. Peeped becomes peaked, and he dashed becomes he dashed. Goodness me, I must go becomes look at the time, I need to go. Round becomes around, here and everywhere else. I'm starting to get very fed up with becomes I'm getting sick of. Rachel said crossly becomes Rachel said. The sentence starting with the doorbell was is split into two sentences. They didn't have much time becomes there wasn't much time. The sentence starting with there was allowed is split into two sentences. Deal with the goblin becomes catch the goblin. Groaned with dismay becomes gasped in surprise. Peered through the glass to see becomes stared through the glass and saw. A sparkling pink shape becomes something sparkling and pink. Gasped becomes cried. Children becomes kids. Into becomes two. Chapter 3. But is added to the start of Rachel's first sentence. Waving their arms madly becomes waving their arms all around. Straight away becomes right away, here and everywhere else. Sparkling pink wand becomes sparkling wand. Rose-colored becomes pink. Handkerchief points becomes a zigzag pattern. The floaty skirt swirled around her legs as she hovered in midair is deleted from the text. Come out into the garden any minute becomes go out to the backyard any second. Off you go becomes ready, set, go. Galloping becomes rushing. Thanks for warning me, girls, she gasped, is deleted. And is deleted from the start of the next sentence. Just in time is added to the end of the sentence about the garden urn. Becomes Down the bottom of the garden becomes toward the back by the fence. I can see becomes I see. Popped her becomes put her hand and Grace. Sweetie becomes candy. Bin with the rubbish becomes trash can with the garbage. Rubbish becomes garbage. A bit becomes a little. That's nice becomes thanks a lot. Smooth down her hair becomes smoothed her hair. In the lounge becomes in the house. Soon is deleted from the phrase, we'll soon put a stop to that. Well is deleted from the sentence, well, now I can. She suddenly gasped and caught Rachel's arm becomes she suddenly grabbed Rachel's arm. Breathed becomes whispered. Looked at becomes peered at. Hanging either side becomes hanging on either side. Behind one of them there was a definite goblin shape becomes there was something behind one of them, and that something was shaped like a goblin. Chapter 4. Goblin bulge becomes goblin-shaped lump. Shift becomes move. A bit fed up becomes a little antsy. Beckoned becomes motioned to. Queried becomes asked. The word anxiously is removed. Creep up becomes sneak up. Difficult becomes tough. The reference to Holly the Christmas fairy is deleted. That is, the phrase, as the fairy king and queen had taken Jack Frost's magic away from 1 year, is deleted. The goblins were their normal size becomes this goblin was his normal size. Magic him away becomes sent him back. Once I'm back in fairyland is removed, as is, and then I'll whiz back here and magic it into place for you too. Put in Grace becomes Grace added. Fluttering alongside becomes fluttering alongside them. Nearly becomes almost. Lounge door becomes door between the kitchen and the family room. The sentence starting with they had nearly reached is split into two sentences. Laden with becomes carrying. Becomes oh. The word possibly is deleted. Exchanged an agonized look becomes we're desperate to catch the goblin. while Mrs. Cooper was in the room is added to the end of the sentence starting with Rachel and Kirsty. The sentence starting with yes, of course is split into two sentences. Set the plates down becomes set down the plates. Have finished becomes finish. The sentence starting with they can have is split into two sentences. Tea becomes cake. The sentence starting with as soon as she had is split into two sentences. Gasped becomes cried, but worse than that becomes but even worse. Vanished becomes disappeared. Set these decorations to rights becomes fix these decorations. You mustn't becomes you shouldn't do that. He's hiding becomes I'm sure he's hiding. Snatch becomes steal. Chapter 5. Scrabbling becomes rustling. Sofa becomes couch, here and everywhere else. Pointing to the sofa becomes pointing. And he's heard becomes he must have heard. The sentence starting with we'll wrap him is split into two sentences. Whisk becomes carry. We'll hide and catch him becomes if we hide, we'll catch. Bag so heavy becomes bag is so heavy. It's because I've got becomes it must be because I have. It's in the shape of a steam train becomes it's shaped like a train. Grace's party bag has changed from blue to pink. Let's go then becomes we can go now. A bit of a squash becomes a tight squeeze. Wait a moment becomes wait a minute. Her blue wand becomes her wand. There's a sparkling of fairy dust becomes surrounded the girls with sparkling fairy dust. In a second becomes a moment later. Glittering wings becomes sparkling wings. Edge of the sofa becomes corner of the couch. A big grin becomes with a big grin. The sentence starting with his beady little is split into two sentences. Beady little eyes becomes beady eyes. Saw becomes spotted. Really pleased becomes so happy. Chortled becomes said. Right over him is removed from the sentence. Fury becomes anger. To shreds becomes into shreds. Chapter 6. What shall we do becomes what can we do. Had an idea becomes got an idea. Called crossly becomes shouted angrily. An Egyptian mummy becomes a mummy. Groaned sulkily becomes sulked. Precious party bag becomes party bag. Time to see becomes time to have a snack and see. Coming in now becomes coming now. The sentence starting with she waved her wand is split into two sentences. The first part is added to the end of the previous sentence. Moaning becomes groaning. Human-sized becomes human size. Tipped up becomes opened. Delighted becomes thrilled. Walls were festooned with becomes hung all over the room. Paper tablecloth becomes tablecloth. The sentence starting with there was even is split into two sentences. Covered with a sprinkling of gleaming silver stars becomes sprinkled with silver stars. The sentence starting with Grace gave a is split into two sentences. A silvery laugh becomes a beaming smile. Just as the children becomes just then the kids. Led by becomes followed by. Have done becomes did. Beamed at becomes winked at. Grabbed a snack is added to the sentence starting with Rachel and Kirsty. The sentence starting with the clown was is split into two sentences. In fits of laughter with becomes laughing at and is deleted from the sentence they were the most. Them becomes the balloons. Lovely giraffe becomes giraffe. So is somebody else becomes they weren't the only ones. Beamed becomes declared. Kids become children. Hooray becomes hooray. Okay, that last one was dumb. The end of book preview. Have got becomes all have. Sweet becomes candy here and everywhere else. Join their next adventure, and this special sneak peek is added to the end. Lovely becomes beautiful. Set lunch becomes set the table for lunch. The shops becomes town. Gran's toffees becomes toffees for Gran. This evening becomes tonight. Shop becomes store. The sentence starting with Rachel is staying is moved to a separate paragraph. One summer holiday becomes when their families vacationed on Rainspell Island. Good friends becomes best friends. The pair of them becomes the girls. From tomorrow becomes starting tomorrow. As this becomes since this. Up for grabs is deleted. The last paragraph is deleted. And that's it. That's about 250 pages for a 69-page book, or 3.62 changes per page.